Yesterday we left off with Henry Clay's Compromise of 1850, which was of course an attempt to solve the issues relating to slavery. Although it did somewhat solve the problem of the expansion of slavery into the territories, at least for now, parts of it really riled up Northern opposition to slavery, and it led to both the growth of abolition and Southerners' more stringent defenses of slavery when pushing back against Northerners' accusations. So, the Fugitive Slave Law was by far the most controversial part of the Compromise of 1850, and how you felt about it depended on sort of who you were and where you were from. Obviously, Southerners, for the most part, supported the Fugitive Slave Law because they wanted to recover their slaves. And Northerners and abolitionists, especially people in the Northeast, opposed it. But in many areas, white people were still racist, which I'm sure is incredibly surprising to you. And so in the old Midwest, some of them supported the Fugitive Slave Law and opposed the expansion of slavery. And so the Fugitive Slave Law drew clear lines between both the North and the South, but also between the Northeast and sort of the western parts of the North. So, the reason the Fugitive Slave Law had the effect of strengthening abolition is because for a lot of Northerners, especially if you were up in Massachusetts or some of the New England states, although you opposed slavery intellectually, you didn't often have to see its effects. But the Fugitive Slave Law both got abolitionists more angry, and so we saw people like Frederick Douglass traveling around speaking against the Fugitive Slave Law, and of course we had his famous The Meaning of 4th of July for the Negro, which I believe you read in English class, sort of making it harder to ignore slavery. But also, and of course also, propaganda is going to convince people. But also the very act of slave catchers coming north and grabbing African Americans and bringing them south in chains made slavery real to Northerners in a way that it really hadn't been before this, where it was more of an intellectual debate as opposed to a sort of emotional debate. The other book that made slavery more emotional and more visible was Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was also published in 1852. Uncle Tom's Cabin was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and it told two different narratives of enslaved peoples. One was a young mother who successfully escaped across a frozen river to the north with her child, and the other was an elderly gentleman named Uncle Tom, who ended up being sold from a kindly owner to a mean owner, to a much harsher owner anyway, who ended up beating him to death. And so these two narratives humanized the slave's plight and made Northerners more sympathetic to abolition in general. The effect of this growing support for abolition is more Northerners became active on the Underground Railroad. And of course, you've heard about the Underground Railroad before, I'm sure. It's quite famous. It's the sort of pathway that escaped slaves could use to get north to freedom. And although you sort of think of the Underground Railroad operating in the South to get them out of slave territory, with the Fugitive Slave Law now increasing the likelihood of slaves being captured, it also existed in the North to get people up to Canada. And so this network of abolitionists and sympathizers helped escaped slaves get through both some in Southern territory, but much more in Northern territory to escape fugitive slave catchers and get them to Canada, where they would be safe, theoretically. Obviously, it was very difficult to run away, and so a lot of slaves were not able to do this, even if they could get information about it. And so the number of slaves that actually escaped on the Underground Railroad was relatively low. But we really like to talk about the Underground Railroad, especially in a place like Kansas, which is associated with the whole Free State movement, because it makes us feel like like people in the North were doing something to help slaves get out of slavery, even though the exact numbers were not particularly high. Another example of pushing back against slave catchers, trying to recapture slaves on the Underground Railroad, was the Christiania riots. So free African American communities were very, very active in the Underground Railroad, and especially in sort of the hostile states of the old Midwest of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. These free communities of color who were helping slaves often armed themselves in order to fight back. And so what's known as the Christiania riot was a free African American community fighting back where that was sheltering freed slaves or escaped slaves, fought back against a group of slave catchers, killing several and driving the rest out. And so this is another example of the North pushing back against the fugitive slave law. The trial of Anthony Burns is another example of Northern resistance to the fugitive slave law. Anthony Burns was an escaped slave who was living in Boston, and he was captured by a slave catcher and then put on trial. And of course, because he was an escaped slave, here's Anthony Burns here, because he was an escaped slave, the judge ruled that he had to be sent back into slavery. But abolitionist forces in Boston, riled up by Theodore Weld and his American Anti-Slavery Society, attempted to free Anthony Burns and launched a sort of attack on the jail that ended up killing at least one person. Although the attack failed, the whole city of Boston, or a significant portion of the city of Boston, showed up when they were escorting Anthony Burns to the dock, and they protested loudly, and Anthony Burns had to be escorted by armed soldiers to the ship, which eventually took him back into slavery. And so although the Anthony Burns affair failed to get his freedom, it demonstrated the length that many Northerners were willing to go in order to aid the cause of escaped slaves. And obviously, Southerners viewed this as utterly unacceptable, because from the Southern point of view, the fugitive slave law is a federal law, and now Northerners are the ones who are choosing to not enforce federal law and violating it for their own reasons. And so to the South, all of this was completely distasteful, because to Southerners, the only thing they got out of the Compromise of 1850 was the fugitive slave law, and now Northerners aren't enforcing it, or at least are putting up a significant resistance to it. And so they were incredibly unhappy about this. Oh yeah, here's Theodore Parker, who was one of the ministers associated with the trial of Anthony Burns. So, at the same time that the North was becoming increasingly abolitionist, the South was becoming increasingly dependent on what became known as King Cotton. The Cotton Kingdom spread across the southern belt of the southern part of the South, sort of what's called the Deep South now. And cotton became, and it was the staple and the cash crop of their economy. So by this point, although there is still some tobacco farming and things like that, cotton has become the primary slave crop throughout most of the South. And even though, as you can see from this chart, the vast majority of families did not own slaves, slavery was so essential to the region's economy that most people in the South supported, or at least didn't speak out against, slavery. And in the end, it was such an important part of the economy that for a lot of Northern manufacturers, they were hesitant to speak out against slavery too, because the raw cotton from the South was the thing fueling the textile industry in some of the Northern states. And so for some Northerners, they had an economic interest in slavery continuing, which prevented abolition from gaining as much traction as it could have. As far as foreign countries go, they mostly had already abolished slavery. England and France had already gotten rid of slavery, but they also hesitated to speak out against slavery because the South was providing European countries also with a raw supply of cotton, meaning that their economic prospects were also tied to Southern states, which prevented them from issuing moral objections to slavery. The South, on the other hand, was trying to fight back against these moral arguments with their own sort of moral cases. And so we're starting to see a transition about how Southerners talk about slavery. In the beginning years of the American Republic, Southerners would describe slavery as a necessary evil or a peculiar institution. And that is not happening so much anymore. Ministers during this time started trying to use the Bible to argue that slavery was okay. Both arguing here, as you can see, that Jesus did not condemn slavery, and also that slavery appeared in places in the Bible, which is a sort of somewhat questionable moral argument there, considering a lot of the stuff that Jesus had to say that was about how people should be treated. But anyway, so they're trying to use this sort of moral argument here. And John C. Calhoun specifically amongst others, argued that slavery was a positive good that benefited African Americans because their masters would provide them with things like food and clothing and teach them how to live properly. And so there was this demonization or this prejudice against African society, and arguing that slave owners are doing things to elevate slaves by enslaving them. And so these very racist arguments, of course, flew in the face of the incredibly brutal treatment of slaves. And so Northerners pushed back against this by trying to publicize these things, trying to get pictures out showing how brutally slaves were treated. And so this led to an increasing polarization. At the same time that books like Uncle Tom's Cabin are humanizing slaves and trying to demonstrate how terrible slavery was, the Southerners are starting to argue that slavery is good in general for the slaves and for the country as a whole. And so abolitionists become increasingly radical. Most specifically, William Lloyd Garrison, who is the editor of The Liberator, starts arguing for immediate, uncompensated abolition and pushing back against any sort of compromise. Yeah, here's William Lloyd Garrison's famous quote: "There must be no compromise with slavery, none whatsoever." And so he gave a speech, this is part of a speech entitled "No Compromise with the Evil of Slavery," which is pretty self-explanatory. Slaves also pushed back against their enslavement. I think we've talked about this before, but in order to push back against the moral arguments, we need to look at the ways that slaves chose to fight back against being enslaved. And so, in general, these are some of the different ways that slaves fought back. The most common was working slowly and inefficiently, or feigning injury or illness, and often running away. But it should be noted that contrary to the popular myth of tons of slaves escaping on the Underground Railroad, most slaves who ran away were running away for a short period of time to simply get some respite where they could be a human being and have some control over their lives. And so although people like Harriet Tubman did escort lots of slaves, some slaves up out of slavery, in reality, a lot of them were just running away for a short time, and then they would be recaptured and probably punished. So slaves did resist slavery to the extent that they could.